Chapter 5, Cell Growth and Division. We can see in this picture here one cell that's in the process of dividing into it's almost finished. It's just connected by a very tiny amount of cell membrane and cytoplasm right here. This process is what we're going to be looking at in this section. So 5.1 is the cell cycle. Cells are basically going to pass through four main stages during their lifetime, at the most. This is a very regular process. It's a continual process. The cell doesn't generally stop as it's going through its life cycle, so this image is shown as a ring. We're going to start the process right here. So we're going to say the first part of a cell's life cycle begins at what's called the gap 1 phase. This is just a time of normal cell growth. It carries out its function. It does whatever the cell is supposed to be doing. It copies its organelles and simply gets larger. By the end of the first phase, it's big enough and ready to start copying its DNA. That's this portion down here, synthesis. DNA synthesis is just the copying of its DNA because before a cell can divide, it has to have two identical sets of its DNA. Once this part is finished, it enters the final phase of interphase called the gap 2 phase. Now you can see these first three are identified as interphase, and they make up the vast majority of the life cycle of a cell. This gap 2 phase, or G2 phase, is just a time for continued growth, making a few more organelles, making sure that the cell is large enough, healthy enough, and ready to enter the final phase, which is called mitosis, or cell division. This phase is then subdivided into other smaller phases, which we'll look at later, and it ends with cytokinesis. And this is where the cell physically pinches itself into two. So each of these phases is, like I said, a continual process. Now, the amount of time the cell spends in each of these phases is a little different. Interphase is the largest portion of the cell's life cycle. The gap 1 is going to be the largest part of interphase. Synthesis takes a while. It has to make an identical copy of all of its DNA, so that's also a fairly significant part of a cell's life cycle. And the final growth phase is fairly short. Mitosis and cytokinesis are the quickest portions of the cell life cycle. Not every cell is going to divide at the same rate. Some cells don't divide at all. Things like the majority of your nerve cells, they never divide. If something happens to one of them, they get damaged or destroyed, then that cell is simply gone. But that's not the case for most of our cells. Things like our skin cells, they have to be replaced on a very regular basis. So about every 2 weeks, our skin cells are dividing. Things like the lining of our intestine are even faster, 4 to 5 days. These cells are what we call highly mitotic cells. That means they enter mitosis. I just went back one slide. They enter mitosis fairly quickly because the body needs to replace these cells on a very regular basis. Some cells, like the liver cells, are much slower, or the muscle cells and some of the tissue cells in your intestine are very, very slow, only dividing every 16 years, if at all. Now, if a cell is not going to divide, if it's never going to make a copy of itself, it enters what's called the G0 phase. Let's go back here. That means a cell has been created and it does its job. It's in the G1 phase, it's carrying out normal functions, it's replicating, it's getting larger, but then once it's fully grown, it stops right about here and just spends the rest of its existence in the gap 1 phase. We call it a G0, or a gap 0 phase, because then it does not continue on through the rest of the cell life cycle. And it's, like I said, going to be different for every cell in the body. Now, one of the other components of the cell life cycle is how big a cell is going to get. We know the G1 phase, the first gap phase, is a time of growth. Well, how big can a cell get? If you think about how many cells are currently in your body, it's approximately 30 trillion. You have to wonder, why are we made of so many small cells as opposed to, say, 100,000 much larger cells? Well, if we look at a comparison between the surface area and the volume of a cell, we find that the volume increases faster than the surface area does. The volume is what's inside the cell membrane. So here's our cell. And this is just an example. Let's make it 1 centimeter large on every side. Within this cell membrane, there is a certain volume of cytoplasm and organelles and nucleus that have to be maintained. Everything this cell needs has to pass through that cell membrane, either nutrients coming in or wastes coming out. Everything must pass through the cell membrane. So we can say, if we measure it, there are 6 sides, that there are 6 units on the outside taking care of 1 unit on the inside. So the ratio, the comparison of surface area to volume is 6 units taking care of 1 unit on the inside. And that's fine. Now let's make the cell larger. Make it 2 centimeters on every side. Well, now the surface area is much larger. There are 24 units on the outside taking care of all the volume on the inside of the cell. So you might think that would be better. That's a lot more surface area. But if we compare, the volume now also goes up to 8. So there are 24 units on the outside caring for 8 units on the inside. Plug that into a ratio. Now there are only 3 to take care of every one on the inside, as opposed to 6 in the smaller cell. This cell is not as efficient. There isn't as much on the outside to care for the same amount of space on the inside. And as we move even larger, we can see the comparison of how much surface area is available for 1 unit on the inside. It goes down even more with a cell that's 3 centimeters on the outside. So the most efficient cell is going to be one that has a very small size. That gives us a better surface area to volume ratio. It makes the cell more efficient. Now some cells, they have a way of kind of getting around this whole surface area to volume ratio thing. The surface area must allow for adequate exchange of material. So everything that this little red blood cell needs or this nerve cell needs has to pass through that cell membrane to get to the inside. The process of cell growth is limited by how big a cell can get, but some cells have come up with unique shapes to allow them to get around having a slightly larger volume. So this cell, you can see most of its volume is right here, but it has these long extensions of the cytoplasm that are basically increasing the surface area without increasing the volume. And so the cell can really get a little bit larger than normal just by making a few adjustments to its basic structure. And we see this in a lot of different kinds of cells. All right, this is 5.2. We will come back to mitosis and cytokinesis in the next recording.